All right, welcome. In this deep dive, we're really going to get to grips with anti-epileptic drugs. We'll start with the basics. What even is a seizure? And work our way all the way down to how these critical medications work on a molecular level.
Okay, so here's our game plan. First up, we'll get our definitions straight. What's epilepsy? What's a seizure? Then we'll look at the neuroscience, the why behind it all. After that, we'll break down the four main ways these drugs work, step by step. And we'll wrap things up by putting a spotlight on some of the most important drugs you'll see in the clinic.
All right, first things first. Before we can talk about the solutions, we need to have a really solid grasp of the problem, so let's define exactly what we mean when we talk about epilepsy and seizures.
So here's the key thing to understand about epilepsy. It's not just about having one seizure. It's an underlying neurological condition that makes a person prone to having these seizures happen again and again, often unpredictably. It's actually pretty common, affecting about 0.5% to 1% of people worldwide. And the causes? Well, they're all over the map. It could be genetics, a brain injury, an infection, you name it. And the seizure, that's the event itself. It's that sudden, out-of-control electrical storm in the brain that messes with its normal function.
And this image, wow, it just shows you exactly what that electrical storm looks like on an EEG. Up top, you've got a healthy brain. See those nice, calm, regular waves? Now look at the middle one. That's a focal seizure. You can literally see this chaotic burst of high-energy spikes erupting in just one part of the brain. And then down at the bottom, that's a generalized seizure. The storm is everywhere, across the whole brain at once.
Okay, so if we're going to treat these seizures, we have to know what kind we're dealing with. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation. This flowchart here shows the modern way we classify them, which was updated back in 2017. And the very first question you have to ask is, where did it start? Did it begin in one spot? That's focal onset. Did it start on both sides of the brain at the same time? That's generalized. Or do we just not know?
So let's start with the first category, focal onset. Just like the name says, these seizures start in one specific or focal area of the brain. From there, we break it down even further based on whether the person is aware of what's happening. If they are, we call it a focal aware seizure. This could show up as a motor symptom, like their arm jerking, or something non-motor, like a weird feeling or a sudden emotion. But if their consciousness gets altered or impaired, it's called a focal impaired awareness seizure. And there's one more possibility. Sometimes, a seizure starts out focal, but then it spreads and takes over both sides of the brain. That one's called a focal to bilateral tonic-clonic seizure.
And this slide is brilliant because it shows you why the symptoms of a focal seizure can be so different from person to person. It all comes down to location, location, location. If a seizure starts back here, in the occipital lobe, the brain's visual processing center, you might see flashing lights or colorful shapes that aren't really there. If it's in the temporal lobe, you might smell something strange, get an odd taste in your mouth, or have that spooky feeling of déjà vu. A seizure up in the frontal lobe could mess with your movement or your speech, while one in the parietal lobe could make you feel numbness or a burning sensation. All right, moving on to generalized onset seizures. With these, the electrical storm involves both halves of the brain right from the get-go. These can be motor seizures, like the classic tonic-clonic. That's where you see the body stiffen up and then start jerking. Or they can be non-motor, like an absence seizure, which can look like someone just zoning out or staring into space for a few seconds. And then, of course, we have that last bucket, unknown onset. We use this category when we just don't have enough information, maybe because no one saw the seizure start, so we can't be sure if it was focal or generalized.
Okay, so we've covered the what of seizures. Now let's get into the why. At its absolute core, a seizure is a problem of balance. The brain's electrical signaling system gets thrown completely out of whack.
You can think of your brain as being in this constant tug of war. On one side, you have excitatory signals that are screaming, go, fire. The main player here is a neurotransmitter called glutamate. When it's released, it lets positive sodium ions rush into the next neuron, pushing it closer to firing. We call that depolarization. On the other side of the rope, you have inhibitory signals saying, whoa, hold on. The main one here is GABA. GABA opens the gates for negative chloride ions to come in, which makes the neuron less likely to fire. That's called hyperpolarization. A seizure is basically what happens when the go side wins that tug of war. Big time.
And that firing process, we call it an action potential. It's this all-or-nothing electrical spike. Once a neuron hits a certain voltage, a threshold of about minus 55 millivolts, it's going to fire. No maybes about it. And what drives that spike? It's that super fast rush of sodium ions into the cell, which you can see as that sharp upward climb on the graph. That's depolarization. After that, the cell resets itself.
In epilepsy, this whole process just goes haywire, and you get these massive, synchronized bursts of firing that shouldn't be happening.
Okay, so that brings us perfectly to our first major strategy for stopping seizures. If the problem is uncontrolled, repetitive firing, then one logical solution is to find a way to stop those neurons from firing over and over again. And that's exactly where our first class of drugs comes in, the sodium channel inhibitors.
So these sodium channels are basically the gatekeepers for the action potential. Think of them as having a three-part cycle. They're closed when the neuron is resting. They flick open to let sodium rush in, which kicks off the spike. And then, crucially, they enter an inactivated state where they can't open again for a little while. It's like a built-in pause button. Now, a lot of these drugs work by latching onto the channel while it's in that inactivated state and holding it there for longer. And here's the really clever part. The neurons that are firing like crazy during a seizure, their channels are spending way more time in that inactivated state. This means the drug has more opportunities to bind and do its job, so it preferentially targets the overactive neurons while leaving the normally firing ones mostly alone. It's a brilliant mechanism called use-dependent blockade.
Okay, let's look at the actual drugs that do this. First up, you've got the old school players, carbamazepine and phenytoin. They are the classic examples of what we just talked about. They stabilize that inactive state and stop the repetitive firing. Then there's lamotrigine. It also blocks sodium channels, but the knock-on effect is that it reduces the release of that main excitatory neurotransmitter, glutamate. Now, the newer drugs have some interesting twists. Look at lacosamide. It's different because it targets what's called slow inactivation, a distinct process from the fast inactivation the other drugs hit. And then there's cenobamate, which is a real powerhouse. It has this dual action where it not only blocks sodium channels in that use-dependent way, but it also boosts the release of the inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA. One last thing to keep in mind, though. A lot of these drugs come with a similar list of side effects, like nausea and dizziness, and they all carry a risk for a very serious skin reaction called Stevens-Johnson syndrome.
All right, strategy number 2. If blocking the go signal is one option, what about strengthening the stop signal? That's our next approach. Focusing on drugs that boost the effects of GABA, the brain's main chemical brake pedal. This diagram gives us a great look at the entire GABA system. So you see, GABA gets released into the synapse, it binds to these GABA-A receptors, and that opens up a channel that lets chloride ions flow in, which quiets the neuron down. Then, to end the signal, GABA has to be cleared out. That happens in two ways. Either it gets broken down by an enzyme, or it gets sucked back up by these little vacuum cleaners called GAT transporters. So this gives us three obvious places to intervene with drugs, right? We can make the GABA receptor itself work better, we can stop the enzyme that breaks GABA down, or we can block those reuptake transporters.
So how do the drugs actually do this? Well, the first approach involves drugs like phenobarbital and the benzodiazepines. They're called positive allosteric modulators. That's a fancy way of saying they bind to a different spot on the GABA receptor. They don't open the channel themselves, but when GABA comes along, they make the receptor work much, much better, letting more chloride in. The second strategy is to stop GABA from being destroyed. The gabatrin does this. It permanently shuts down the enzyme GABA transaminase, so the GABA that's already there sticks around for longer. And the third tactic? Block the cleanup crew. That's what tiagabine does. It clogs up that GAT1 transporter so GABA can't be removed from the synapses quickly, letting it keep doing its inhibitory job.
Okay, on to our next set of tools. We're going to cover two more important mechanisms now. First, we'll look at blocking calcium channels, which is super important for a specific type of seizure, and then we'll check out some of the newer drugs that have really novel ways of working.
Calcium channels are another major player in all of this. Let's look at the image on the left first. This is showing us the thalamus, a part of the brain that's like a central relay station. There are special channels here called T-type calcium channels, and they're the main culprit in causing the rhythmic brain activity you see in absent seizures, so blocking them is a key strategy. Now look at the image on the right. This shows a completely different mechanism happening at the nerve terminal. Here, P/Q-type calcium channels are the trigger that causes vesicles full of neurotransmitters to be released. So if you can block these channels, less calcium gets in, and that means less of the excitatory glutamate gets released. It's another way to turn down the volume.
This table really pulls together these different strategies. You've got ethosuximide, which is the go-to drug for absent seizures because it specifically targets those T-type calcium channels in the thalamus we just talked about. Then, for focal seizures, you have drugs like gabapentin and pregabalin. They work in a clever way. They bind to a part of the P/Q-type channel, which messes with its ability to get to the cell surface in the first place. Then, you have a totally different mechanism with levetiracetam and its cousin brivaracetam. They don't target a channel at all.
Instead, they bind to a protein called SV2A that's on the little bubbles, the synaptic vesicles, that hold the neurotransmitter. By doing that, they disrupt the whole release process. And it's worth noting, brivaracetam is about 10 times more potent at binding to SV2A. And last but not least, you have parenpanel, which works on the receiving end. It physically blocks the AMPA receptor, which is one of the main places where glutamate has to dock to deliver its go signal.
Okay, to wrap this all up, let's pull everything together and focus on a few of the real heavy hitters in the clinic. The drugs that are either used a lot, have multiple actions, or are used for very specific situations.
First up is valproate. This drug is a beast. It's so broad spectrum because it hits 3 of the targets we've talked about. It blocks sodium channels, it blocks T-type calcium channels, which is why it's great for absence seizures, and it boosts GABA levels. But that power comes with some really serious warnings. It's teratogenic, which means it can cause birth defects, so it's a huge no-go for women of childbearing age. It can also damage the liver and even cause hair loss. Now let's talk about the benzodiazepines, like diazepam. These are our emergency drugs. When someone is in status epilepticus, a dangerous nonstop seizure, these are what we reach for. Clonazepam is an interesting one because it also hits those T-type calcium channels, so it has a role in absence seizures too. The big problem with benzos, though, is the heavy sedation and the fact that people build up a tolerance to them really quickly, sometimes in just a few months, so they're not great for long-term maintenance.
And finally, let's look at 2 very specialized drugs that show where the field is heading. First, there's vigabatrin. It's a very potent drug that permanently shuts down the enzyme that degrades GABA. But it's only used for the toughest, most resistant cases of epilepsy. Why? Because the side effects can be devastating, including permanent vision loss. Then, on the complete cutting edge, you have a new drug called ganoxolone. This is a great example of precision medicine. It's a modulator that only works on GABA receptors that have a very specific protein subunit. And because of that, it's been approved for a single, rare genetic condition called CDKL5 deficiency disorder. And this really shows you the future of treating epilepsy, moving away from these broad, shotgun-style drugs and towards creating highly specific therapies that target the exact genetic problem. Which really leaves us with a big question to ponder. What is the next frontier in finding and targeting the precise genetic roots of epilepsy?